In 2024, a Silicon Valley founder sat in his bedroom and wept. He had spent years building a culture of absolute employee comfort, wellness programs, uncritical psychological safety, a workplace that felt like a family. When the market turned and the numbers demanded an immediate 30% headcount reduction to preserve the company's runway, he refused. He cited his relationship with early hires, empathy for their families, and terror of being seen as cold. He chose empathy over arithmetic. He delayed the layoff process by 18 months, optimizing through minor cost-cutting that offended no one and solved nothing. The company burned its cash, missed its debt covenant, and collapsed into a Chapter 7 liquidation. Every single job in the building was destroyed, and his kindness was the engine of their destruction. This is not an isolated tragedy. It is the logical endpoint of a doctrine that has quietly colonized the global boardrooms over the past decades. Packaged by high-priced consultants, celebrated in graduation speeches, and elevated into a corporate religion, we are told the ultimate virtue of a modern executive is empathy. We are told a great leader must feel what their people feel, bleed when their people bleed, and manage through the lens of pure emotional connection. It sounds beautiful. It is also a strategic lie. The post-2010 cult of vulnerable leadership has transformed a basic human trait into an operational hazard. Most leaders have been conditioned like house pets to chase moral approval from below. They want to be the kind executive, the compassionate boss, and relatable savior, but history and market data tell us an entirely different story. At the lower tier of an enterprise, performative empathy is a mere annoyance. At the top, it is an existential risk. Empathy is a moral luxury tax on performance, and the higher you rise, the more it costs. When emotion vetoes reality, you are not protecting anyone. You are buying your own comfort with the organization's survival, and in the worst cases, you are writing a eulogy for every person who trusted you. To understand how this destruction works and why the kindest leaders are often the most dangerous, we have to look beneath the rhetoric and perform a psychological autopsy on what happens when feelings replace thinking. The modern business world routinely conflates three entirely distinct states: affective empathy, cognitive understanding, and strategic detachment. Most leaders cannot distinguish between them, and that confusion is what kills organizations. Affective empathy is a biological reflex, the visceral contagion of feeling another person's pain as your own. When a leader operates in this state, their prefrontal cortex is effectively hijacked. The part of the brain responsible for cost-benefit analysis, long-term forecasting, and dispassionate judgment goes dark. They're not connecting with their people, they're drowning in the emotional wake of the room. This cognitive hijack triggers a dangerous phenomenon known as the identifiable victim effect. An empathetic leader will meet one vocal employee with a compelling backstory, and they will override the hard data affecting 10,000 silent stakeholders. The single face wins, the spreadsheet loses, and thousands of people who never got a meeting pay the price. Now, contrast this with cognitive understanding, the ability to map another person's emotional state without absorbing it. You see the contours of their fear, frustration, and desperation, and your judgment remains intact. This is what trained therapists and hostage negotiators practice: empathy as intelligence, not empathy as contagion. You are informed by someone's pain, not inflicted by it. Strategic detachment goes one step further. It is the capacity to factor human cost into a decision without letting human emotions drive that decision. A strategically detached leader acknowledges that a layoff will cause suffering, loss of income, disrupted families, and wounded ego, but makes the call anyway because the alternative causes more people more suffering over a longer horizon. This is not coldness. It is the mathematical recognition that refusing to inflict a small controlled wound today guarantees an uncontrolled hemorrhage tomorrow. Here's the distinction that matters. A real leader practices cognitive understanding plus strategic detachment. The kind leader, the one celebrated in the modern empathy cult, operates on affective empathy alone. The first two build, the third corrodes. and the difference between them is not personality, it is discipline. Performative empathy is often more dangerous than outright indifference. Those who broadcast their compassion the loudest often weaponize it to shift responsibility and extract resources from everyone else. They don't use it to solve problems. Let's tie it all together. Consider a manager who protects an underperformer because they're going through a tough time. It sounds kind, but this is a triple betrayal to the standards the organization depends on, to the disciplined operators who absorb the slack, and to the underperformer who is denied the one intervention that actually might help: honest feedback. Proclaimed empathy becomes a sophisticated form of moral evasion, one that feels virtuous while compounding long-term damage, forcing reality to degrade further while the empathy collects social credit for their compassion. When this emotional evasion scales across an executive team, the financial and cultural costs are immediate, severe, and compounding. Empathy in leadership introduces 4 systematic structural failures, and each one acts like a slow poison, invisible until the patient is already terminal. A leader inherits a failing product division. The unit has already missed revenue targets for 3 consecutive quarters, and the market data says, kill it, reallocate the capital. But the leader has spent 18 months mentoring the division head. She has attended his child's birthday parties, and the personal connection overrides the spreadsheet. So she authorizes another round of funding, another restructuring plan, and another year of decline. She traded capital efficiency for interpersonal comfort, and the hemorrhaging continues in slow motion, draining the resources that could have funded a new profitable venture. In an empathetic culture, low performers learn fast that tears, narratives, and personal drama functions as a shield against accountability. A single tearful performance review can delay a necessary termination by 6 months, and the employee absorbs the lesson instantly. Emotion is a get-out-of-accountability-free card. They manipulate the leader's emotional mirror to paralyze the review process, and the organization pays the price in lost productivity, crumbling morale, and a standard that means nothing because anything can be excused. Capital, time, and executive attention are finite. When empathy dictates allocation, the squeaky, dysfunctional team gets weekly leadership check-ins, emergency strategy sessions, and a disproportionate share of the budget, while the quiet, high-performing profit center gets a quarterly glance in a dashboard. The broken part of the company consumes the fuel that the healthy parts need to grow, and over time, the entire engine stalls. High performers do not want to live in a corporate sanctuary. They want to live in a meritocracy. When they watch a leader tolerate mediocrity and protect underperformers under the guise of compassion, their morale doesn't bend, it breaks. They realize their extra effort is not being rewarded. It is simply subsidizing someone else's dysfunction. They update their resumes, take their talent to a competitor, and leave you running a museum of excuses staffed by people they carried. The leader who tries to comfort everyone ends up presiding over a funeral. Your emotional indulgence transforms an enterprise into a charity, and charities do not compete. Let us examine what happens when sentimental paralysis meets the reality of the market up close in operational detail. The Silicon Valley liquidation I opened with was not a one-off tragedy. It was a textbook case of affective empathy short-circuiting fiduciary duty. Let's look at the exact mechanism. The 18-month delay was not strategy. It was emotional paralysis dressed as compassion. And the universe does not negotiate. By refusing the small controlled wound, she engineered the catastrophic hemorrhage. 30% became 100%. Nowhere is this destructive calculus more exposed than in the inverse case, where the leader refused to let empathy vote and the numbers rewarded him. In 1997, Apple was weeks from bankruptcy, choked by over 350 separate products, each one kept alive to satisfy an internal engineering faction that had grown comfortable. The product matrix was not a strategy, it was a monument to organizational sentiment. Jobs returned and did something that still offends the modern empathy cult. He walked into the boardroom, looked at the numbers, took a marker, and drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. Consumer, pro, desktop, portable. He also laid off thousands of employees who were deeply invested in their work. The internal outcry was savage. He was labeled cold, calculating, and heartless. But here is what the critics missed back then and what the empathy cult misses now. By refusing to let feelings override arithmetic, Jobs saved the entire system. He protected the core capital infrastructure, allowing Apple to survive, rebuilt, and ultimately generated millions of jobs and trillions in economic value. Those canceled projects did not die in vain. Their sacrifice funded the iPhone, the App Store, and one of the most valuable companies on Earth. Jobs understood what the empathetic founder could not. A leader's primary loyalty is not to the immediate emotional comfort of the individuals in the room. It is to the unyielding survival of the company. There is a truth that the average performers are free to ignore and the elites must absorb into their bones. The higher you climb, the narrower your behavioral latitude becomes. An average employee can operate on uncalibrated emotion. They can let their feelings govern the day, choose allegiance based on personal affinity, and retreat into emotional comfort when the pressure builds. Their choices have consequences, but the blast radius is contained. A bad mood might ruin a meeting, but it will not vaporize a balance sheet, destabilize a supply chain, or trigger a wave of layoffs that reshape an entire community. An executive elite has no such insulation. When you sit in that CEO chair, your emotional state is no longer a personal matter. It is an operational variable, one that influences thousands of livelihoods, dictates capital allocations across entire divisions, and sends signals that ripple through markets. You are not merely a decision maker. You are a fiduciary steward of other people's futures. And stewards do not get to be sentimental. Here's where the empathy cult's defenders typically object. They will tell you that this philosophy is coldness disguised as strategy, that removing emotions from leadership will produce inhuman, sterile organizations ruled by sociopaths in the corner offices. This objection sounds compelling. It is also a category error. It confuses warmth with temperature. A leader can be deeply present, genuinely invested in the people they lead, and still unwilling to let their emotional state contaminate any decision. A surgeon does not weep over the incision, not because they're indifferent to the patient, but because their hands must be steady. The general does not negotiate from guilt, not because they're blind to the cost of war, but because sentiment at the command table produces body bags. These are not contradictions. These are the defining discipline of high-stakes roles. Sovereign leadership means processing information as raw data, not as a strategic command. You observe the fear in the room. You register the insecurity, manipulation, and hidden agenda. You factor all of it into your model and then decide based on what the architecture demands, not on what your nervous system prefers. The leader who feels everything can ultimately protect no one. Strategic detachment is not a psychological defect. It is a higher order form of care, the disciplined commitment to preserve a system even when the immediate moment punishes you for it. If the diagnosis is clear, the prescription must be equally precise. Sovereign detachment is not a personality trait you are born with. It is a discipline you install. Here are the 3 protocols that prevent sentimental decay from colonizing your decision architecture. Never review personnel changes, structural adjustments, or product closures while looking at faces or reading personal narratives. The moment a face enters the frame, your brain switches from analytical to social processing, and the numbers lose. Force every major strategic evaluation through a quantitative audit before you allow a single human story into the room. The sequence is not a technicality, it is the entire game. Every leader has blind spots. The employee who reminds them of a younger self, the division they founded, or the loyalty they cannot separate from liability. You will not see these biases yourself. That is why you need a designated operator whose sole function is to audit your decisions for hidden empathy, unearned loyalty, and personal affinity masquerading as merit. The person is not your confidant. They're your corrective mechanism. Their job is to tell you when your emotions are writing the check that your balance sheet cannot cash. Define your performance metrics, boundary lines, and termination protocols publicly and explicitly long before any crisis arrives. When the storm hits, you do not make a decision. You execute the pre-existing architecture. The emotional negotiation has already been settled. There is no room for a tearful appeal because the standard was locked in place when the sun was shining and the data was clear. This is not rigidity. It is the recognition that your future self, the one under pressure in the room looking at a human face, cannot be trusted to make a clean call in the moment. So you remove the moment. These three protocols function as a single system. Together, they convert leadership from an emotional improvisation into an engineered discipline. Here's the final verdict of the mirror. The leaders who let empathy rule their boardrooms are not kinder. They're simply weaker. They're using the language of compassion to mask an underlying cowardice, an inability to look reality in the eyes and make unpopular cuts in order to preserve the system for those who are depending on it. Stop chasing moral validation from the crowd. Stop trying to run your enterprise like it is a sanctuary of feelings when it was engineered to be a monument to execute. A leader who prioritizes being loved over being accurate will eventually be neither. True strength is the willingness to be viewed as the villain by those who cannot see the architecture, simply because you possess the clarity to protect the structure that they're standing on. In my next video, we move to the most guarded vulnerability at the peak of enterprise, isolation at the summit, the loneliness epidemic undermining elite decision-making. Up to 50% of chief executives operate in chronic isolation, a psychological tax driven by constant pressure and the paralyzing fear that signaling a single moment of vulnerability will be read as operational weakness. We will dissect how this forced withdrawal triggers emotional numbing, warps risk assessment, and creates a vacuum where catastrophic blind spots multiply, because you have locked out the very operators required to keep you grounded. Because the ultimate threat to your empire is not the aggression of the market, it is the absolute silence of the room. I will see you then.